Greetings, everyone. Hi.
Hello.
Greetings from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition office in Minneapolis.
The land of Minnesota.
That's right.
The land of smoky water, as the Dakota originally referred to this territory.
Right, and I am just checking to make sure that we are recording, and we are. So this live broadcast will be recorded and placed on our website later for those of you if you want to listen back, or those who weren't able to attend today. So thank you for joining us, and just checking here how I can configure my screen. And okay, there we go. Nope, it's still, bear with me. Okay, so today's webinar is the boarding school and adoption eras, intergenerational impacts of child removal. We're primarily going to talk about the child removal survey that has been launched as a partnership between NABS and Sandy White Hawk's organization, the First Nations Repatriation Institute, and the University of Minnesota. So we'll get into some of those logistics and details later, and we'll do our formal introductions in just a second. Just want to cover a few logistics for those of you who haven't joined the webinar series as of yet. And just a recap for those of you who've been joining in, we appreciate your loyalty to this series. But you will see on this webinar interface on the right-hand side of your screen is a panel, and that panel has you are all in listen only mode, so you're automatically on mute, so you don't have to worry about that. It does have a section for questions, so you can go ahead and type your questions as we are presenting. And yep, I see this. Somebody said, can you unmute the audio? Still muted. That was 4 minutes ago. So so the person who sent that, can you respond and let us know you can hear us? I believe I did unmute, and I'm pretty sure you can all hear. Okay, so we have somebody listening in on the other side of the office who says, yes, you can hear me. Yeah, we were muted for the first couple minutes until we started the broadcast. So you can go ahead and type your questions in as we are presenting, and we will get to those at the Q&A session at the end. We don't have any handouts that we're sharing, but there will be a poll here. When I switch to the next slide, which is, there we go. So I think we'll do our introductions and then we'll meet you all. So Dinaway Magani Duk, Diindiisi Indigenacas, Makinak Waju and Dunjiba, Migizi and Dudame. I am Christine Diindiisi McCleave. I'm the Executive Director for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I am Anishinaabe from Turtle Mountain, and I am Eagle Clan. And I will let Sandy introduce herself.
Mitaki api. Chante washte onape chiuzapi. Sicangu Lakota himataha. Lakota mia chokata najiwia. Wabene chavo pakta uhamani. Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Sandy White Hawk, and I said that I was from the Rosebud Reservation. That is where the Sicangu Lakota reside. And I also said that my Indian name is Chokata Najibia, stands in the center woman. Greetings. Hello, goodbye. I'm looking at this screen that says who's on the webinar, and I feel like I should be talking to people, so I got a little whacked out there for a moment.
Okay. So I just launched that poll. So you should see that on your interface. Who's on the call today? Do we have any boarding school survivors, descendants, or neither? And so it looks like we have about 70% of people have responded. It's 74%. I'm going to close it here in a second. So go ahead and respond to that poll. And yep, 85% of you have responded, and it looks like 48% of you are descendants of boarding school students, and 52% neither boarding school survivors. So we don't have any survivors on the phone today, but We know that they are in our hearts and with us in spirit. So next one is, are you an adoptee or a fostered individual? So go ahead and respond to that poll. If you're an adoptee, if you were formerly fostered, neither or both. So it looks like we have some adoptees in the audience.
You know,
we have some that are both. Yeah.
I had forgotten or never thought of this before, but children of adoptees are impacted just as descendants of boarding school survivors. And I never asked that question. And I think we need to add that in the future, Christine.
That is a good point. Yeah.
You bet.
You're right. Yes. My mother, I'll talk about that in a later slide, but yes, I would be a descendant of somebody who was adopted out. So, and that did impact me.
Exactly.
Next and final poll is, what sector are you joining us from? Tribal services or urban Indian services? Are you in social work or child welfare, academia or higher education, or K through 12 and early childhood education? Oh, there's a lot of other. I got to figure out what the heck that other is.
Who are those others?
Yes, yes. Okay.
Is there a blank for them to fill out what it is?
There's not, but you could use the question section and you could type, if you responded other, please send me a note in the question fields and just tell me what sector you're from so I can. And the thing about these polls, when you administer them, is you can only give 5 options for a response. So I got to figure out what the other response should be. Okay, great. So thank you. Thank you so much for participating in that poll and helping us learn about who is listening in as we go through this webinar series and we cover various topics. It's interesting and good for us to know who is tuning in for what topics that we cover. So NABS is a 501c3 nonprofit. We were incorporated in 2012 under the Navajo Nation. Our vision is restoring Indigenous cultural sovereignty, and our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that was created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. Go ahead and introduce First Nations.
Yes, First Nations Repatriation Institute was born out of a grassroots effort to bring awareness and healing to Indian communities impacted by adoption and foster care. After several years, it became apparent there's a need to be have a more formalized approach. The goals of First Nations Repatriation Institute include the following areas: education, scholarship, and advocacy.
So I'm pretty sure most of you who are online with us today have heard about this child removal study that we have launched. We actually launched it April 1st at the NICWA conference in Albuquerque this year, and it's an online survey. Paper copies are available as well. So we're going to talk about that and how this all came about. So bear with us. We're going to be really informal and relaxed as Sandy and I, might bounce back and forth, and this is just, we're having a conversation with you guys like we're sitting in our living room. So, we have these slides, but we didn't like rehearse. And so in thinking about talking about this next slide, the study's purpose, it almost makes me think of going back to, how this came about.
That's right.
And that we might have wanted to start with your slide. So Sandy did another study that was just focused on adoptees that we will talk about in some later slides. But that is how this all came about. And when we said we need to do another study like that and we need to expand it to boarding school survivors, one of the other things that we realized was that there is this correlation between adoption and foster care and then subsequent boarding school experience and then subsequent adoption and foster care in later generations. And we, through Sandy's work and what she does and through my work and what I do, we've heard these stories. And so we know the anecdotal evidence is there. And so that was one of our research questions for this study, is to prove the correlation exists. So that's the first purpose of the study, is to examine that correlation. And then also, and the larger focus of the study ended up being, we want to know the impacts. We also know that anecdotally and actually experientially, what these impacts are as both adoptee and boarding school survivors and generational survivors. So we look at both the impacts in areas of mental and behavioral health, physical health, calling on the information that we have from ACEs studies and what we know about epigenetics and the impacts of trauma on childhood development, and relational things like parenting. And so all those questions are in the survey, and we'll talk more about those later. And then also we added if we're going to talk about the impacts, we also want to examine the healing and what are people doing to healing, and how is that going in Native populations. So the other thing is also to say that this child removal survey is specifically focused on Native Americans. And so there is a question at the beginning of the survey that says, are you Indigenous from outside the US? And I believe we do, I can't remember what we decided. I think we do let them take the survey because we thought, if somebody's on here and wants to take this survey, we'll collect that data, but we need to be able to separate it out when we analyze the data and publish a report, which that will happen hopefully in the next year or two. You know how that goes, but the survey is still open, so we are still collecting responses. So the study design, we developed the questions based on these history of the work that Sandy and I do, and partnered with the folks over at the University of Minnesota in the Humanities and Social Sciences departments. And basically they, helped us get through the IRB process and set up the survey online. And we're all principal investigators on this study, Sandy and I and our counterparts at the University of Minnesota. If you go online to take the study, if you look at that information, it is listed there. I believe it's also listed on our website, boardingschoolhealing.org, more detailed information about the study. So this is kind of repeating what we already said. So why do we need a study like this, right? Well, just a quick recap about boarding school history, which I'm sure a lot of you already know, is that children, it was by specific design, and it was a federal policy that children would be removed from their home, from their community, from their family life, and specifically from their culture, and the purpose was forced assimilation. And this was the strategy that the US devised to deal with the quote-unquote Indian problem. And the problem was that they wanted the land and the Indians were in the way. I mean, to sum it up, really, in the most basic of terms.
And they wanted to save money.
Yes, because war costs a lot. So, I mean, we could do a whole webinar just on Pratt and the history of Carlisle and the Hampton Institute and how this all came about to be a federal program. We could do a whole webinar about Indian wars and treaties, and we could dive deep on all of that history. But basically, this sums it up that although there were mission schools around the country, and ever since there was contact with settler colonialism here with the indigenous peoples, that it was already happening. These schools were being set up, and forced conversion and forced assimilation was happening. This is when it became systematic and government endorsed. So Richard Pratt changed that motto from the only good Indian is a dead one to what he thought was more compassionate and more in line with Christian ideals, was to kill the Indian in him and save the man. Result, of course, was cultural genocide. So these schools were militarized. So if they were run by the federal government, they were very much like a military school. If they were run by a church, there was still some of that aspects, but then it was also religious militantism, I guess.
Regimented.
Yes, very regimented. So the militarized schools, we have some quotes from boarding school survivors that attended Chamawa, which was the second federal off-reservation Indian school that was opened after Carlisle, which was the first. It says, they gave me the number 76. I was number 76. All my clothes, underwear, socks, dresses had number 76. When my laundry came back folded, it had a slip of paper with number 76 on it. So you can see how they weren't even treated as humans. They're, not a name, I'm just a number.
I want to add an experience I heard when I was an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation on residential schools in Canada. A nurse came and wanted to testify and give her testimony. So she was a white lady who worked in a hospital that was close to one of the residential schools. And she wanted to share the most heartbreaking thing she experienced and was still moved emotionally by it, was that little children that would come to the hospital, she would always ask them, "What's your name?" And they wouldn't tell her, they would tell her their number. So some of those children died in those hospitals because of whatever they had contracted that their immune system couldn't fight, or they died from abuse given to them through the punishment. And she said that not one child in the years that she was at that hospital broke and shared their name. They always stuck to saying their number because of what would happen to them if they did say their name.
Wow. So, to that effect, there has not been a collection of these testimonies the same way in the US that happened in Canada, because it was part of this commission in Canada. And the commission was established as part of a class action lawsuit, and the federal government settled and, of course, acknowledged their boarding school policy and launched the commission. And here in the US, the government has not acknowledged, and there is no legal path forward for a class action lawsuit because of the statute of limitations being expired in many cases, or the statute of limitations being shortened in certain states to avoid these type of lawsuits. But we, NABS, could do another webinar, and we probably will, and we're working on publishing some information on, recommended methodologies for collecting these oral histories and taking cues from the way they did things in Canada to make sure that they provide support for survivors when asking about these traumatic experiences. As we know, abuse happened in a lot of boarding schools. Not every boarding school student experienced abuse, but a lot of them did. And so, we've actually had boarding school survivors come talk to us, students who would say, I didn't have to survive any abuse. I loved going to, whatever boarding school. I had a good experience there. I met my spouse there, or whatever. And we honor and validate everybody's experience that they had. However, we also know that simply living away from your family and living away from home could be a traumatic experience in and of itself. And we also know that the historical boarding school model, which is what we focus on here at NABS, really was based on assimilation and prohibition of language and culture. So we always look at that as something to acknowledge, even if they didn't experience any physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. We would consider that probably spiritual abuse, to deny them their culture and language. So here are some quotes about that sexual abuse that happened. You notice that 2 of these quotes are from the 9 little girls in South Dakota, and they have efforts going on right now to change the statute of limitations so that they can file a lawsuit against the Catholic Indian boarding school where they were all sexually abused. All 9 little girls attended the same school and were all sexually abused. In South Dakota, this legislation has come forward several times and has not passed yet. Previous to this statute of limitations, the statute of limitations was in line with the federal regulations, which was 40 years. And currently it's 3 years after you turn 18, you have to bring forward your lawsuit. And if you don't, that statute is expired. So by age 21, you have to report this abuse. And we also know from things like the Miriam report and the Kennedy report that there were issues in boarding schools, right? So this is all just kind of validating, why we need to look into the impacts of child removal. Also, in working with Sandy, who's a member of the board, as well as our partner on this study, Sandy and I, in our conversations, started to think about, what's going on with the adoption era and current foster care leading into adoption, and then looking back to boarding schools and that whole correlation as the Indian boarding school policy was the US's first Indian child welfare policy. So that was the first federal policy that the United States government made about Indian children, was to remove them and send them to boarding schools far away from home. So when you look at it like that, and then you can see the arc and the flow from, government says, here's what we're going to do with Indian children. We're going to take them and send them to school and assimilate them into our culture and language, which is cheaper than waging war on their communities and tribes. And then through the outing system and other things, they found that really assimilation happened much faster if you put the child directly in a westernized home. So as the Indian boarding schools were starting to shut down, as the reports were coming out that there were problems with the schools and they were also expensive, the Bureau of Indian Affairs launched the Indian Adoption Project. So I'm going to let Sandy talk about this. This is her area.
So do people know what that outing system is?
I don't know, but I'm trying to keep it moving because we don't have time to go into everything. But yeah.
Well, it was just the outing system. I'll just say it basically trained people to be domestics, farmhands and domestics, which is even what they were doing in the boarding schools as well, is teaching women that and teaching the men. But so the Indian Adoption Project was a marriage between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Child Welfare League of America. And they came together and created the project called the Indian Adoption Project. One of the things that I like to emphasize is that the Indian Adoption Project itself was only responsible for 395 placements. And in those placements, they did keep track of them, and they did a report I can't remember how, I think the children, so it was from 55 to 64, the project. I could be off on the 60s on the other end of that, but Fenchel is his first name. Can't remember or Fenchel is his last name. Can't remember his first name right now, but he did a study called Far from the Reservation, and it was interviewing, and it is called an adoptee research project, but I don't call it that because he only spoke to the parents of the adoptees, and they were all prepubescent at that time. And we know experientially that problems arise during adolescence and as people mature and develop beyond that. But on that report, it basically says everyone was getting along and doing well. But even Fenchel at the end said that tribes should have the power over their own children and be able to make those decisions. So, but the impact that the Indian Adoption Project had was they then trained private adoption agencies, and so Lutheran Social Services, Catholic Social Services, and other agencies. They trained them and told them basically, because of what we found out, there's all kind of children that need placement. So began that systematic removal. And we have so many kinds of infiltrations that the government did to obtain these children. One of the they're all heart-wrenching, but I've met several families who their mother was told that one of the children that was placed in for adoption, that the child had died. So back in the days of the 50s and 60s, and even in the early 70s, children were always taken and put in a nursery. And oftentimes that's when the removal would happen, especially if the mother didn't have a partner, a dad there. Sometimes they were told your child died overnight and then not given anything else. And back then, our people really didn't understand, or had fear, didn't know how to work against the system, didn't have support there to help them with that, would often go home with that grief and not have any sense of power whatsoever. So we know that happened. On the Potawatomi Reservation in Hannahville, Michigan, I heard firsthand accounts of how the adults and families on that reservation supported themselves by harvesting pulpwood, and they would go out in teams into the woods, leaving the older children with the younger children. And social services, knowing that there were not adults in the home, went in onto the reservation, house to house with a car, and went into the homes and took children. And one of the people who I heard share her account was in her late 60s, and she was still saying, as she recounted the day that they came, she said that, why did I open the door? I still kick myself that I opened the door, because that's the day my brothers and sisters and I were all separated, and all those parents were charged with child neglect, and yet everybody's in a family's had to, if you were the older person, had to watch your younger sibling at some point in time. But there were all kinds of reasons for these removals: no electricity in the home, no running water, there's just countless stories of that. So, and then today we're still seeing a lot of coercion. We're still seeing unrealistic timelines in if anyone has a child welfare or child protection case open, to come to closure of that case, often lose their children today as well. So it's still, while there was this era, the legacy left from that era is, it seems like it's still here, especially now since Minnesota is at 23 times more likely that an Indian child will be removed from their home than anyone else in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, so that gets at, that brings up so many things that I'm thinking about, including when you mentioned, ICWA and tribes having a say, and that's really because it's a question of citizenship. These are tribal nations, so it's, the recent attacks on ICWA being unconstitutional because it was race-based. It's not a question of race, it's a question of citizenship. And also, the whole ICWA being challenged really negates the whole history of why ICWA was enacted in the first place. Why did we need an act to protect Indian children? Oh, look at that, my next slide. Why we needed ICWA in the first place. Okay, so we just kind of covered that, right? Pre-colonization, our families were intact. We were happy. we were caring for our children. We loved our children. They were sacred to us. Boarding school era, military institutions, breaking up our families and communities and tribal nations. Really, it was aimed at breaking up our tribal nations. And then the adoption era, placing children directly in non-native homes, and continuing today into the foster care era, where, like Sandy said, children are placed at higher rates per capita than any other ethnicity in Minnesota, other states like Alaska and California, pretty much all over the country, depending on how good and accurate they are tracking that information. But ICWA is still necessary to protect our children from this race-based child removal, which was intentional, systematic, right? Okay, so you guys get it. We're really beating a dead horse here. Okay, so Sandy, tell us about the Gathering of Children powwow.
The Gathering for Our Children and Returning Adoptees powwow is the first Saturday of every November for the past 16 years. I can't believe it's been 16 years.
Yeah.
Yes. So it came as a result of a white social worker actually seeing, and I have a reason now why I'm saying white social worker. Why is she pointing out white? It's not, trust me, it's a happy ending. As we mentioned that my work started at a grassroots level led by Chris Leith, a Prairie Island elder who was the spiritual advisor to the National Indian Child Welfare Association. He is the individual who took what I was saying to him and said, you're right, we do need to welcome our relatives back. This is what is meant to be in terms of bringing the extended family back through, that's what the law is made for, to protect our families, bring them back. And so a social worker saw us do a ceremony where we were welcoming relatives back at Niquay in 2000, Tina Nafla from Hennepin County. And I tell this part because I didn't want to have anything to do with her because she was a white social worker. I didn't want to work with white social workers. Why would I want to? I had a lot of anger, frustration, bias, and eventually Chris, called me on that and said, no, we need to work with everyone. People need to be educated. People need to be to see how they can be part of a solution. And he really taught me that how important that was. And so we got with her, and she formed a committee. And in 2003, we had the first gathering for our children and returning adoptees powwow. And it was very important for an elder, I don't know who it was in the community, really wanted this gathering for our children powwow. She wanted the focus to be on children, and yet they also wanted to have a focus of welcoming relatives back. So that's why the title came the way it did. So that social worker, Tina Nafla, is still part of the team, along with Jackie Wilson, who is the Boys Fort Urban Director. And she was there on that original committee and there for the first powwow as well. And so this powwow, we have a giveaway for our youth. We have an honoring for our youth who turned 21 in foster care, and we say it our young relatives. We don't call them fostered individuals or foster youth. We don't say they aged out of foster care, because the more we label that, the more distance we put between them and us. They are our young relatives, and they need to know that we see them and that they're part of us. So we offer them a quilt, and we have an honor song for them, and it's quite a beautiful time. And then we have a ceremony where we offer the song that was made for addressing that grief of loss, separation from our culture, and through the pipe ceremony and using the bundle that I was given, we have that healing time. And so adoptees have traveled from as far away as Hawaii. Yeah, at Hawaii, last year, about 3 people came from California. People come from Arizona, Kansas, Illinois, you name it, they've been here because they long for that acknowledgement, you know, and it addresses what Maria Bravehorse, Yellowheart Bravehorse talked about, and we don't talk about it enough in the education of historical trauma, is disenfranchised grief. That grief that's not acknowledged publicly. And if that's not acknowledged publicly, and as Indian people, we've experienced these boarding school and adoption as a collective. So we need a collective healing. And the way we do that is through our songs and our ceremonies collectively. So if you can make it to Minneapolis on November 2nd, I invite you to come. I also invite you, if you really can extend it another couple of days, on November 1st, we have an evening called Family Celebration, Indian Family Celebration, where we celebrate and honor the families that have been reunified with their children after a child protection case is closed. So that's November 1st, and you would be welcome to attend that as well. So you can contact me for details, but I invite you to come to either and both events.
Will you be screening the Blood Memory documentary?
Oh, not this year. No, we did last year,
okay.
But yeah, not this year.
Yeah. So, so this next slide is a photo taken from that documentary, and do you want to tell them a little bit about Blood Memory?
Well, you know who this is? Angie Hirsch's little girl,
okay.
From who was at the powwow, and then that's from a church from out in South Dakota. What am I telling them about?
Just what Blood Memory documentary is.
Oh, so Blood Memory is a film about, it's uses my history, my story, and juxtapose it against an attorney here in the cities who is now really working to overturn the Indian Child Welfare Act, and shows you know, that both sides of that, the importance of the law, how, you know, prior to the law, and then the law, and then how it's being attacked. And then in the end, we talk about and show my tribe's first year of welcoming our relatives back, and that's the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And so so Blood Memory has been well received so far, and in terms of educating and sharing that history, firsthand accounts of people living through adoption.
I was looking for a slide that was about your story. And I think I might have it later in the PowerPoint where it's like personal stories, and then Sandy and I tell our stories. And I was like, I feel like Sandy should tell her story now, but I think it's a later slide. So breaking the silence. So this is about your first survey and research study that was focused on adoptees. Do you want to tell us about that quickly?
So we opened it up on Facebook through all conferences, NICL conference, anybody who would publicize that you could take this survey. So 336 people responded, and they were all individuals. You had to be in the United States. You had to have been in foster care 6 months and longer, and be an adoptee. And so we have a lot of representation, cross-racial representation. So there's years of study we could do in there. 129 identified as First Nations. And of those 129, we looked at 95 respondents because 95 of them said that they had been reunited to a family member of their tribe or some sort of reunification. So when we broke it down, we saw that the majority of them were women. It doesn't say that in that black section there of the pie, but that was the women. And I say snidely, so the opportunity that we were given by being adopted is, they always would say that you would have, better opportunities if you grew up in a white home. So here it is. Most of us have some college, bachelor's degree, and income-wise, it looks like we can pay the bills. And so that was our opportunity that we were given. And the average age is 50 years old.
Oh, I just fixed it. No. Let's look at it for a second. No.
I know, huh? So what we have to really chew on and figure out, what is it that we are going to do with the information we have found. We found that there is significant abuse in adoptive homes. 23 of the 95 experienced sexual abuse, 44 of the 95 experienced physical abuse, 47 of the 95 experienced emotional abuse. So what this does is it shakes up the adoption narrative that permanency through adoption is the answer to children who are placed in foster care, whose families are slower at bringing themselves along on that healing journey. And one of the things I guess, like what I try to get people to think about is, we should be surprised, but we shouldn't be surprised at this. When we look at the statistics of an Indian woman, is like 1 in 3 Indian women will be molested or raped in her lifetime, and 1 in every 4 Indian boys. So then we think of physical abuse as it exists cross-culturally in this country. And when we even think of the sexual abuse that exists cross-culturally, we shouldn't be surprised that children are going to be placed in homes that could possibly be a place where they're going to be abused. Most sexual offenders are not reported. So someone can pass a background check, and we don't know if that child will actually be safe there. And what's absent in the adoption mechanism is there's no way we can go back, because the adoptive parent basically owns the child now, and because of that, you can't, their privacy, their right to the child and everything. And I say owned because adoption is based in property law. So based on that fact, there aren't any mechanisms there to say, well, wait a minute, we want to make sure the child is safe. So a well-meaning family may adopt an Indian child, and even if no abuse existed in the home, sexual or physical, they could be completely disconnected with the understanding of what the child will experience racially, and may not have the language, may minimize what's happening to the child in school with their friends, and it's so problematic and complex. So the thing that I try to stress with this is that we need to relook at how we're doing adoption, and it needs to be adoptee centric and not adoptive parents need or want for a child centric. And we need to have a protection mechanism in there. And I think based on our sovereign status, that we should be able to develop that. We should be able to say, well, we want to make sure the child, wouldn't you even want to make sure the child is safe? Wouldn't you be horrified if a cousin or somebody is hurting your child that you've adopted? Wouldn't you want to know? Not placing blame right up front, but saying that this is a possibility. Well, we have barking dogs in the background. Oh.
He's upset about this topic too.
Yes. So anyway, it's very important. So this led me so I knew that the numbers were going to be like this just based on the years of my meeting individuals who've been in place for adoption. This led me to, well, I bet you, because we didn't ask the question, I bet they could all say to these individuals who were placed that their families, some close family member, parent, grandparent, had been in boarding school.
Right. And that's what, we had heard through people's stories that they shared, personal stories and oral histories that they shared with us. And so we did include that question in the current survey. And really what Sandy was talking about just now also, I hear Sandy talk about this a lot, about the commodification of our children, really. So when you talk about this whole thing being based in property law, it's, Sandy talks a lot about how, there's money to be made off of these children.
Well, the average cost for adoption, I believe, $60,000 to $100,000 for an Indian child. So that's a lot. When you think about it, how much and how long does it take what all goes into that? But I can't remember. Oh yeah, so this slide, I think we need to also really look at this. Look at this contemplated suicide. 43 of the 95 individuals said that they contemplated or planned suicide. That should scare us enough. And then 20 of these 95 attempted suicide. So back when they were gathering testimony and information about adoptees, then they were talking about the suicide rate was high and the incarceration rate was high as well for adoptees. So, and the numbers here should just frighten you. 51 in therapy, and depression report is, so these are things that we need to look at to protect. If we were talking about protecting children, this is what we want to protect them from.
And so for the current survey, we incorporated these questions, but we also expanded on them. And this really segues nicely into the effects of trauma, because as you were talking about that, that high instance of depression, and the one of the previous slides cited the 2015 White House report on Native youth, which declared a state of emergency nationally because of the suicide epidemic amongst Native youth around the country, and found that our youth had 3 times the rate of the average American of post-traumatic stress disorder, which was the same rate as an Iraqi war veteran. So PTSD, very prevalent. And really when you get into the psychology of it, it's not just PTSD, it's historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, current trauma, which then the DSM manual doesn't have a diagnosis for. And it's labeled complex trauma, because you're talking about layers of trauma. So it's complex trauma. And Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart defined and coined the term historical trauma. She defines it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. So when she came to our conference last year and was the keynote, she talked about how a lot of people think historical trauma is just about what happened in the past to your ancestors, or they think about it. It's misnomer, really, because as you can see from her definition, it's also encompasses what happens to you in your lifetime. So that is also historical trauma. And then, of course, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, with her work on epigenetics and the study with Holocaust survivors, showing that their children were more likely to develop anxiety or depression, and showed the epigenetic markers that were the same as if they had experienced the trauma themselves. And then so she replicated the study with Iraqi war veterans, and of course, you know, they had PTSD, and so she could see the differences in their cortisol levels, and then found that their children also had the same changes in cortisol levels and the epigenetics that attached with that PTSD, even though those children had not been to war themselves. And then the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, and what we know about the effects of trauma on childhood development and the brain, and really what, you know, what happens within the amygdala and your hippocampus with your adrenal response and cortisol, and how your brain actually gets trained to respond a certain way, and then that, you know, that leads into many things, not just anxiety and depression. But what the ACEs study found was that if you had 4 or more of these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, then you were not only more likely to have depression or anxiety as an adult, but you were also more likely to have substance abuse. You were more likely to develop heart disease and diabetes. I mean, so we know from research that this is not just linked to our mental and behavioral health, but also physiological side effects of trauma. And then, of course, the cycle that happens. If you have a child who experiences these adversities as a child, they grow up and they have these impacts and effects of the ACEs, and then they have children that they might be giving these experiences to as well. That's the intergenerational trauma cycle going on right there. So we're going to skip that because we're running a little bit behind. But here we go, personal stories. So I'll go first. And really, you know, the reason I do this work and the reason I like to talk about this is because I have a personal experience with it. In fact, that's what prompted me to do my master's thesis on the connection between Christianity and Native spirituality and the impacts of that forced conversion, because of what happened in my family, where, as you can see pictured on the screen here, my grandfather, who's on the right side there, Lawrence Willett, he went by Buddy, from Turtle Mountain, and he went to Marty Indian School, which was a Catholic Indian school, and he never wanted to talk about his experiences. He would always say, I don't want to talk about it, but he also never wanted to step foot in the Catholic Church again, so we don't know what happened, and just know that something negative happened to him. And then he went to Haskell. At the time, Haskell was not a university, it was a trade school. And he learned masonry, and he built the house that my mother grew up in. Also, my great-grandfather, pictured on the right, went to Carlisle, and he played football. He was recruited by Pop Warner, and he played football at the same time that Jim Thorpe was there. So a little bit of a different experience than a lot of the students who went to Carlisle. My great-grandfather, John Willett, was actually 20 years old when he arrived at Carlisle, so he was an adult. And he was treated differently because he was on the football team. So, but still there's that connection to boarding school there in my family. So 2 generations of boarding school experience. And then, and I don't know what happened to my grandmother. I'm still looking into that part of my family history, but my grandfather and my grandmother ended up giving my mother out for adoption. And it was what we would call an open family adoption. So basically my great aunt raised my mom. And the result is, you know, this message to my mother that she wasn't wanted, that, you know, or that she was being better off being raised by someone else, so she experienced abuse. And then when she had me, or actually when she got pregnant with me, she was told to go to an unwed mother's home. And she did, and it was, I believe, a Catholic institution. And so they told her to give me up for adoption, because, you know, it was at the time where being unwed, and particularly in the view of Catholicism, was not good, and, you know, taboo, and you should be ashamed. And so my mom actually almost gave me up for adoption, but she decided to keep me, right? So a little bit of healing starts to enter into this. And then as I grew older and started to learn more about this family history, it was around the time when I started struggling with my own parenthood. And when I had my first child, I ended up giving custody of him to his father. And it wasn't until like a good 10 years later, you know, much farther down the path on my healing journey, that I started to awaken to the awareness that this was an intergenerational family dynamic, and that the reason I gave up my son, and the reason I felt like I was not a good parent, and the reason I felt like I didn't have the right skills, was because of many generations of being removed from our traditional parenting ways. A couple of generations of people being raised by institutions, a couple of generations of people being separated and abandoned, and you know, all these issues were coming out. I did later get custody of my son back, and I also have a daughter who I have never given up custody of, and I never will. So lots of healing there for me, but I always share this because you can clearly see, you know, 5 generations laid out there, and how the boarding school and adoption and child removal played itself out in my family's history and my story, and how it really is key to have the awareness of this and that history. And it, honestly, the full scope and the full picture of this did not become clear to me until I had already been working at the Boarding School Healing Coalition for at least a year or two. So really, like, this is, you know, this is very personal work for people. It's very hard work, and you know, the truth comes when you're ready, basically.
What did we say?
It says Sandy's story.
Adopted as a, okay. So I was adopted out from the Rosebud Reservation when I was 18 months old. Back in the old days, 1953, I was born. So in 1955, I was adopted. And I just recently found out, well, you know, you look at documents, then you look at them again, then you look at them again. And I just found out that because churches were part of this adoption era as well. And this church I was adopted by this white missionary family that had moved from Illinois to South Dakota to work with the Indians, as my adopted mom would say. And the pastor of this church was the power of attorney in the absence of my mother in my adoption. So it's easy to think that, well, it's probably because, you know, she was just out drinking and doing, you know, not concerned about her child, not wondering, you know. And yet when I know the backstory of that, and also have heard so many birth mothers talk about their experience, that, and so much shame and guilt, because back then you could not live with a relative legally well, you could live with a relative, but if child welfare came along and said, well, where's your home? Well, I'm living here with my cousin, or I'm living here with my aunt. That was not a suitable home. You couldn't live in an extended family and have your child. So you're considered, you know, vulnerable because you were living in that way. So my mother wasn't able to keep a home because of probably what she experienced in boarding school and the trauma, unresolved trauma she had. But I remember when I met my uncles, this one uncle told me, the first thing out of his mouth was, you know, your mother loved you. She always loved keeping a home, but she struggled. And that was all I needed to hear and understand and know, because I became an addict and a single mother, and I did struggle as well. And so I didn't have any hard feelings about what happened in terms of on that end. So as I weathered through the hard placement that I had in my adoption placement, my mother, adopted mother, I just really believe had mental health issues that were never addressed, and I suffered as a result of that. So I became an addict. I married and didn't marry in a very healthy way. And it wasn't until 1988 that I went back and met my family. found my family and began that healing journey. So in everything, I was healing from being taken from my family. I remember the day I was placed between two white strangers who became my adoptive parents. I remember it from the back of a pickup bed. So I left my body through trauma that very first introduction to them. And so I have that experience of complex trauma that they all talk about now. But so I've had that trauma of removal, the trauma of being sexually molested, the physically abused, spiritually abused. And then because of all of that, that's all I knew. So then I found places where I could replay those tapes. And it took me I was sobered up when I was 28, and 7 years later went home to the reservation. And I really believe that I needed those 7 years of sobriety to heal from what I learned, how the adoption really affected me, because that brought me to my knees. After many years of healing, when I was home on our reservation, 1999, 10 years after I'd been home, I was sitting almost in the same place that I was that prior 10 years. And that's when I had an experience where, through watching a special, that I realized that I had never seen any of us welcomed back. I felt welcomed back. I met my family. I felt they encouraged me. They said that every year somebody comes back in our family and finds us. But what I was concerned about was other adoptees were not as fortunate as myself, and I wanted to be able to help them. And I know that what helped me more than anything was song and ceremony. So that's how my work began.
And through these conversations and the relationship that's been blossoming for the last few years between Sandy and I, we realized that the brokenness, the path to brokenness for boarding school students and adoptees and fostered individuals was very similar, as was the path to healing, which was to, if the brokenness happened through disconnection and removal, the path to healing for all of these people and all of us was also very similar, to reconnect and to return. So we started to see that connection.
Yeah. And there's one other, maybe that'll be a good segue to what
it is.
So one of the things that I saw, another similarity that we've not talked about, and I've not written much about it, and I think I need to write more about it, is adoptees, when they return to their families, it can be jarring for the family and jarring for the adoptee, because for all intended purposes, an individual who is raised away from their family, culture, and community are white. All we know is how to act by the place where we were raised. So when we come back to a Native community, we stumble, we may be disrespectful without realizing it. But what's interesting is that a lot of Indian families will struggle, communities will struggle, and they will not have patience for us, and will be judgmental, and will think that we will never be able to contribute anything to community because we were raised white. It's not a lot different than what people that were coming home from boarding school experience. Their families saying, they couldn't speak the language, they didn't know our ways, and so we have to educate our communities in a way that give them ways of understanding and help them devise ways to welcome individuals back and say, so in our community, we don't do this. In our community, you need to sit down and not worry, and not, because we don't even realize that we're competitive, that we have to have a say in everything, that we have to, because that's how we were taught. That's white culture. I shouldn't say culture. I don't think that's a culture. This white way of life is competitive in so many ways.
Yeah.
And so that's all we know. And I had one guy, I love the way he said it. He goes, yeah, when we come back, we're all hyper and we talk really fast and use weird words. and to scare people. And I think that that's really true. And so if it had not been for the people who were very good, kind, loving friends to me, who taught me, and I remember specifically at times them saying, Sandy, don't say anything right now, just wait. You know, or that person just told you something and you ignored it. And I'd be like, what'd they tell me? Because I couldn't even hear, I couldn't even hear what I was being taught. So if they had not done that, I would not have been on the path that I'm at. And then Chris Leith taking me into that deeper understanding of how to bridge between cultures. So I think that's very important. But we can, through our education and through our compassion, teach our communities that community building aspect of how we bring our relatives home.
Mm-hmm. And we do ask about that in the survey for boarding school survivors, if they experienced or how they experienced returning to their community, or if they return. Some people did not return, as we know.
Yeah.
And our hope for healing, as we know, is that, if we carry that intergenerational trauma in our DNA, we also carry that resiliency, that strength, that connection to our ancestors, that blood memory. And Dr. Braveheart also talks about the process of moving forward from our historical grief. It's a very simple 4-step process. Memorize these. Everybody should know these, right? Number 1, you confront the historical trauma. 2, you understand the trauma. 3, you release the pain. And 4, you transcend the trauma. So truth, healing, and reconciliation must include that truth in history, that awareness and understanding as part of those 4 steps that Dr. Maria talked about, that healing, and then that transcendence. Reconciliation, you point out here, reconciliation cannot take place between unhealed peoples. So yeah.
And I want to, are you done?
No, we've got like another 15 slides, and we've got 10 minutes.
I want to quickly explain
Yeah.
why truth, healing, and reconciliation, because you're going to see most other places have truth and reconciliation.
Yes.
And my friend from Crow Creek, or Fort Thompson as it's called, but Crow Creek as it's known traditionally, when I was speaking there at an elders gathering, an elder had spoke up and said, don't say truth and reconciliation. You have to include healing. If you don't include healing, there'll be no reconciliation. And what she meant by that was, she told the story how in 1999, South Dakota had been named, the governor had named that year the year of reconciliation. And she said, no one came to our community to hear what happened to us, what we lost, what we experienced. So she said there was no one to tell the truth to. So no healing took place, and so no reconciliation. And my friend from Crow Creek, I asked her, who was it that said that? And she can't recall either. But I think it's important to understand and know. And we always, that's Indian way, is we always acknowledge who gives that teaching. It takes a minute to tell the story of how that came to be. So in terms of how the model we created at First Nations Repatriation Institute, the truth is that sharing your experience. The healing comes through whatever that community wants to do to have that healing. But it's healing to have your experience acknowledged. It's healing to hear songs and put those songs and the medicines and the back into your spirit as you've opened that wound. And reconciliation is about changing and building relationships. After you've heard the truth, you change. After you've shared your truth, you change. And so that reconciliation begins at that time. That's not the end at all. It is the beginning. And it's a process, not an event.
Mm-hmm. And that really gets to why, NABS is trying to focus on that education, awareness, and bringing out the truth, right? So like in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had access to all the boarding school records for 150 schools they had in Canada. Here in the US, 357 boarding schools in the US, and we don't have all the records, and they're spread out across the country. So we're focusing on that.
And we don't even know if that's all the schools, right?
I mean, we were the ones who
It could be
compiled the
more.
list. We're still finding schools here and there. There could be more than 357. Past numbers estimated 500, but we believe that included 150 day schools. And, you know, just back to that truth, the records is a huge part of that. But that's just one side of the truth, right? That's the federal record or the church record. And then the other side of the truth is the oral history. And, you know, here at NABS, we want to make sure that we are centering Native perspectives, and that anybody who's doing academic research or telling this story or trying to do truth, healing, and reconciliation, that it's coming from the Native people, that it's coming from the survivors, from the descendants, that this is our history, this happened to us, and we should be the ones telling the stories. So, to that effect, we did the Healing Voices Story Collection, which is still in progress, and we'll launch that hopefully soon. If you go on our website, we have a resource database. Here's the list of boarding schools. I'm trying to hurry up so we can get to some Q&A here. And we recently did a filing to the United Nations on children who went missing at boarding schools. So if you go to boardingschoolhealing.org, you can find all this information. You can even read the submission that we sent to the United Nations. And, you know, to the effect of our vision of restoring cultural sovereignty, we uphold tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty, which is, data sovereignty is a recently relative term, and it's the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data, right? So all this boarding school data, it's ours. These are our people, our children who went to boarding school. So if anybody's doing anything with the data, they should be consulting with tribal nations and tribal people. So this, I'm just gonna really quickly, the trauma informative qualitative research of our study. So, you know, we make sure that we are not shaming or blaming. We provide resources to people because we're going to be talking about traumatic situations. So we give that disclaimer when they sign the consent. You know, we disclose the risks and benefits of the study. Again, this is an IRB approved study. And then whenever we send the study to a tribal nation, we go through tribal IRB as well. So sometimes, in some cases, a double review process. And then we, at the bottom of every single page for the online version, you'll see this link here that says self-care and trauma resources, which, so we provide that to people. And then for the paper version, we give them the paper list. And so this is an example, you know, it not only has like a breathing exercise if you're having a panic attack that you can try to, you know, bring yourself out of that, or it has hotlines for people to call and speak with a crisis counselor like right now, right? So we're not trying to leave people on their own if they end up experiencing triggers through this survey. And then, like I said here, strategies for self-care, that breathing exercise, and then just some general suggestions for how they can do that self-care to take care of themselves. And on the question, if they indicate self-harm, then there is a pop-up. You know, so we've really done a lot of work and taken a lot of care to try and care for people. As Sandy and I know from doing this work, you know, whenever we go out into a community where we know there's going to be boarding school survivors or adoptees and descendants, that you always take care, and you bring a counselor or a spiritual advisor or somebody who can care for them as things come up. Things come up, and people need that support. All right, Q&A. Okay, so thank you everybody for your patience and understanding. We have 3 minutes left, but I can actually extend our webinar. I just want to be respectful to your time. If you have to jump off, then, you know, maybe you can come back and listen to the recording if you asked us a question to see if we get to it, because we actually have quite a few questions here.
Awesome.
Yeah, so let's see. Okay, so, hi Sandy, it's Miranda.
Miranda!
Okay, so we've got some nonprofit people. A child of adoption, okay. And so these are people who responded to the poll when I said, you know, what's the other? Okay, so just personal research, okay, archivist, cultural heritage, indigenous communications. Yeah, yeah, hey, we'll check you out. Green Network Project, race relations advocate, okay, so part of a church. Okay, great. Okay, so seeing if there are any questions here. Appreciate you. This was for you, Sandy. I don't know if there's a question at the end, but I'm going to read it. I really appreciate you mentioning it depends on how well states are collecting data regarding their foster care population and ICWA applicability, etc. I've been watching Minnesota data collection and reporting for years and saying that we will see many other states' disproportionality rates going up if AFCARS ICWA reporting requirements are enacted and states begin to accurately gather and report this data. So it's more of a comment. Do you have anything to add to that,
Nope.
Sandy? Okay.
Right on.
Okay, can non-natives attend?
Thank you, by the way.
Yes, thank you. That was Jill. Can non-natives attend that powwow in November?
Yes, anyone's welcome to attend up the powwow. The grand entry is at 1 o'clock, so I would advise you come at 12:30, get a good place to sit, and so you can see the grand entry, and then there will be a session, we call it, until 5 o'clock, and then we break for a meal, which you can partake in, and then at 7 o'clock, the dancing and partying begins, or continues until 10.
Yes, celebration. Will these slides be available afterwards? Yes, we are recording this webinar, and so once we put it on the website, which I know I keep promising and hasn't happened, but it will happen soon, I promise that. More promises. So what denomination? Okay, I'm not sure. So I'm not sure what part of our talk you were asking about the church. It might have been during Sandy's, when you said it was a church that involved in your adoption.
The church that was involved in mine is an independent fundamental church. It was pastored by I'm going to say it wrong, the Indian Society of Missions, something. So it was an independent church and very fundamental.
So some people sending us private things that we will review, and some people having reflections. So thank you for sharing that. And so here's a question for us. What do you recommend for individuals researching boarding schools, such as looking at archdiocese or church records? Well, that's kind of a big question. From what we know, the research is complicated. And so we would have to kind of narrow that question. It depends on what you're looking for. And if this question is, I'm just gonna.
Could they contact you and have
I know this person, yeah. Oh. So I'm gonna formulate your question, and if I got it wrong, follow up with me. Okay, so specifically, if you're looking for church records, I would say you'd have to know what boarding school you're looking for, right? So because they're gonna be spread out in different church archives. So, and that's part of what we're doing right now, is trying to find those records of church-run boarding schools. And, some are going to be at the diocese. We know some are at different institutions. And so it really depends, if you're looking for a specific boarding school, that would be one way to narrow that research and to try and find the records. Also by knowing the denomination and knowing where to maybe start. But if you're looking to say something like, a comparative study of, different boarding schools that were run by the United Methodists, that's going to be more difficult because we don't know where all those records are. But we're working on that. So this one, I don't see the rest of the question. It just says Sandy's experience, but okay, no, that was a continuation from a previous comment. Okay, collecting information from the church archives in regards to a mission school that I would like to share. Wonderful, we would love to see that and to work with you and have that information. as some of you may or may not know, if you've been following NABS on social media and our emails and our website, that we are building a digital archive to make those records accessible, and big part of that is just identifying where the records are. Is also part of the UN filing, and prior to the UN filing, we filed a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, and requested this information from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Of course, their response was, we don't do research, because guess what? They don't have all the records in one place, right? So that question of boarding school research is a very complicated one. What can be offered for healing the complex trauma for current students still attending boarding schools in operation? I want to let Sandy answer this, but really quickly, I want to say that we know we are in partnership with a couple of these boarding schools that are still open, that are starting efforts to acknowledge that history. And I believe that is going to go a long way for people's healing, for that particularly, but I think, you know, Sandy has a lot to say about healing too.
So it's about people that are attending boarding school currently? Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that we know about people who are attending currently, it really is a choice. And or, as we heard in one of our sessions, someone shared that they felt that the boarding school that they went to saved them from what was happening in their family, because their family was struggling so difficultly. They just, for them to be away and out of that. But to me, what would make sense is what Christine had mentioned, is what they do at Haskell. My kids are both graduates of Haskell, got their bachelor's degrees from there. The beginning of every year, there is an acknowledgement. They go down to the cemetery and they say the names of all the individuals in that cemetery and acknowledge the one that's unknown as well, and have a ceremony. Then throughout the year, they have times where they come together, because a student might experience something. This is where that intergenerational effect is in existence. And there are individuals at Haskell people who live in Lawrence, who come then and are elders and knowledgeable in our life ways, come and they have ceremony. So, you know, things unfold over a period of time. So a child is going to school there, they start to see and realize how their family's been impacted, because the coursework is going to teach them our history. And so there is a constant revelation. And as those revelations come, they understand and can see it a different way, how that's impacted them. So we have to have an ongoing, just as we would in our community, someone people can go speak with, someone who knows songs and ceremony, and acknowledgement of that throughout the year. When I know that some kids, when they got back to school, the first thing they did was rebuild the sweat, because they knew that they would need to go and do that to take care of themselves. So I think the kids, they can help turn that around. I know a young girl, a friend of ours, friend of the family, she wanted to go to Flandreau. Mm-hmm. The town that they were living in was too difficult for her the school was too much of a challenge for her racially. So she wanted to go to Flandreau, and she's done well there. Mm-hmm. So today, I don't know that we should be calling them boarding schools now.
Yeah.
I think we have to have a different name.
They are boarding schools, but yes, they're not what we call the historical assimilative model, yeah. Right? So one of the interesting things, I was able to visit Chemawa last year, and one of the interesting things is that the students there are very connected to their culture. So whereas the historical assimilative model prohibited language and culture, today most Indian boarding schools encourage language and culture.
Yes, exactly.
And that's just like a world of difference right there.
And built-in healing component.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's a lot of times where healing is going to happen for people. And, you know, just to kind of expound on that question a little bit more, you know, healing is a very individual thing. You know, we get asked about healing a lot. We don't have any prescription for people because it's going to have to be culturally relevant. You know, all these tribes, we don't all have the same culture. We don't all have the same ways. And not everybody has had the same experience and the same trauma. So healing first has to be very individual. And then it also, healing is gonna eventually involve, you know, beyond the individual, it's gonna go extend to your family. It's gonna extend to your community. And so it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's not you by yourself. I mean, it definitely starts within, and but it's going to involve other people. And so in cases like a student at a current boarding school, you know, they're going to be doing their individual work for healing, but they're also going to eventually be impacting the student body, the people running that school, as they raise that voice and say, you know, we need to, like Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart said on this slide that I'm showing right now, number one, we need to confront this history. The truth in history is where everything starts. Truth in history, and also truth with our own histories, right? Acknowledging those histories in our families and our own trauma and experiences. So first we have to confront it, and then we have to understand it, and thus the healing journey is underway. So we've gone about 10 minutes over, and I see a couple people who've sent in things saying, you know, they'll connect with us offline. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and have a great day. Feel free to send us any questions at info@nabshc.org, or go onto our website at boardingschoolhealing.org, and come to our conference in November in Tulalip, November 19th through the 21st. We hope to see you there.
All right. See you, everyone. Thank you.